All right, this is going to be a homework walkthrough of homework chapter 6-2. And there's a couple tricky things in this one, so I'll tell you about them when we get there. So for question 1, Worley Corporation's contribution format income statement for the most recent month is shown below. So I got this straight out of the book. My sales are 7,100 units, and this information is all given. They want us to first, we consider each case independently. What would be the revised net operating income per month if the sales volume, oops, I need to fix that. It's supposed to be 40. 90 was last semester. So if I increase by 40 units, and then my second one, what if it decreases by 40 units, and then the revised, what if it was 61,000 units? Okay, so for this one, I just put right here, my original units was 7,100, and my increase and decrease is 40. And my new units for number 3 is 6,100. And the reason I do that is because I want to be able to reference these numbers to do my calculations. Okay, so this is where we started. And so for the new total sales, right, that's going to be equal to my sales price times, open parentheses, my original units plus 40, right? Because I increased by 40, close parentheses. Okay. Now, if I go in here and I anchor those two cells, I can then drag that formula down for my variable expense. So now it's my variable expense per unit, which was given, times the original units plus 40. Okay, we know that contribution margin equals sales minus variable expenses. And my fixed expenses stay fixed no matter how many units I produce or sell. So 54,800. And then I know net operating income equals contribution margin minus fixed expenses equals net operating income. So for my first one, for an increase of 40, I get 59,440. So basically, I'm just making little mini income statements right here for each scenario. So for scenario 2, we're going to decrease it by 40. So I'm going to equals my sales price times, open parentheses, my original units, and I'm going to anchor that one, minus my decrease. I'm going to anchor that one. Okay. I'm going to drag that formula down to do my variable. So again, it's my variable expenses per unit times the original units minus 40 because I'm doing the decrease. Now this one, because I didn't anchor the cells, I can drag that formula over here to get my contribution margin, right? My new sales minus my new variable. Fixed stays the same. Whoops. That's what I forgot to do. I didn't anchor it. Can't drag that one if I don't anchor it. Otherwise, it'll then reference this empty cell. And I don't want it to do that. And now I know fixed expenses is going to be the same for my third scenario where I produce and sell 6,100 units. So I'm going to drag that over there. And again, I can drag this formula over. Nope, that's not what I want to do. Got to grab the little box in the corner until it turns, the plus signs turns. It looks like that. Then I'm ready to drag it. Okay. So there's my second number. This one's not right yet because I don't have my information here. So now I just do the same thing. My sales price times my new units of 6,100. I'm going to anchor that. So then I get my variable by times the variable per unit times the new units. And then I subtract, right? Sales minus variable expenses equals contribution margin. My fixed expenses are the same. Contribution margin minus fixed expenses equals the net operating income. So there's my answer to number 3. That is all on that one. Okay. Question 2. Last month, when Holiday Creations Incorporated sold 37,000 units. Okay, so they sold 37,000 units. Total sales were 148,000. Total variable expenses were 122,840, and fixed expenses were 39,800. Okay, so see how I just pulled all of those numbers out and put them here, labeling them. So the per unit is going to go here. My totals are here. Oh, I don't know what I did. Anyway, this is my number of units. Apparently I did the per unit over here. So to figure out per unit, right, that's going to be the sales divided by the number of units. Same with variable, the total variable divided by the number of units. That gives me my per unit for both of those. Well, I'm not sure if I need that or not. We'll get there. Sometimes I do extra work just because. Okay, so they want us to figure out what is the company's contribution margin ratio. So there's a couple ways we can do this. We can do it per unit, or we can do it using the totals. So our contribution margin and our contribution margin ratio. Okay, so I want to show you that regardless whether I do it by the totals or whether I do it by the per unit, I'm going to get the same ratio. So I guess I should get that. Huh. Anyway, I don't need the contribution margin for this one. So we're just going to do the ratio. We're going to skip that because you don't need it. So to do the ratio, you do the part divided by the whole. So the variable expenses, oh, wait a minute. I do need the contribution margin. Sorry. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. So my contribution margin is going to be equal to the sales minus the variable. Okay, there's my contribution margin total, right? If I wanted to do it per unit, I take my sales price and my variable expenses per unit. Okay, so again, I'm showing you 2 different ways to get to the same contribution margin ratio. So if I'm doing totals, then I would take the part, which would be the contribution margin, divided by the whole for sales, right? We want to know what percent is contribution margin of sales, is divided by of, the part divided by the whole. And that's how you get to a percentage. So I have a contribution margin ratio of 17%, which That is the answer for number 1. Now I just want to show you, if I only have per unit information, I can still get to the same ratio. I still just take the part for the contribution margin per unit divided by the sales price per unit for the whole. The is divided by the of. And I get that same 17%. So either way, just make sure if you're doing the total contribution margin, then you divide it by total sales. If you're doing per unit contribution margin, divide it by the sales price per unit. And that will give you contribution margin ratio. So number 2, what is the estimated change in the company's net operating income if it can increase sales volume by 275 units and total sales by 1,100? Now that we have the contribution margin ratio, we know that the increase in net operating income is going to be the contribution margin from that increase in sales. So my change in sales was 1,100. So all I need to do is find out the contribution margin from that change in sales. And so I will take the change in sales times the contribution margin ratio. So my estimated change in net operating income is $187. Okay. Question 3. Data for the Harriman Corporation are shown below. So they give me the selling price per unit, the variable expenses, contribution margin, and then the percent of sales, or this is my ratios, right? Fixed expenses are 76,000 per month, and the company is selling 2,500 units per month. So I'm going to put my units right here, and they just told me fixed was 76,000. Okay. How much will net operating income increase or decrease per month if the monthly advertising budget increases by 8,100? The monthly sales volume increases by 100 units, and the total monthly sales increase by $8,000. So the first thing I need to do is figure out these other numbers for my original net operating income, right? Because I can't figure out what the increase or decrease is until I know where my starting point is, and then I can do my changes. So for sales, you just do the selling price times the units, and then the variable expense per unit times the units. And this is the original units, right? We're not doing the change yet. We're just doing the original. And then net operating income is sales minus variable minus fixed. So there's my original net operating income. So now I can figure out the changes. So the first change, let's see, we're increasing our monthly advertising budget by 8,100. So that advertising is normally a fixed expense. So that is going to get added to the fixed expenses. So I'm going to take my original fixed expenses and add 8,100. Okay. So then I increased my sales by 8,000. And I increased the units by 100, right? I'm going to use that one to figure out my new variable. So my increase in units times the variable expense per unit. Okay. So now I can drag this formula over, and I have my sales minus my variable minus my fixed. So now this is where I started, was 14,000. And now my projected net operating income is 9,500. So obviously it decreased by the difference equals this minus. So my next question is, should the advertising budget be increased? Well, we lost a lot of money, so the answer is no. Okay, now question 4. We're the same company, right? Same data, only we have a different scenario. So let's see. Um, so my units again are 2,500 and my fixed um, is 76,000. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly fill in my original information. So again, that's going to be the units times the selling price per unit. And same with the variable. And then I could have copied this over from the previous worksheet, but okay. So there's my original information again. Now, what are we changing? Refer to the original data. How much will net operating income increase or decrease per month if the company uses higher quality components that increase the variable expense by $4 per unit? Okay. So now my variable expense is going to be this plus 4. Okay. And increases unit sales by 20%. So I'm going to now, my original units times 1.2 or 1 plus the percent, because I want to add 20% to my original number. So now I'm selling 3,000 units. Okay. So now take the sales, or I need the new number of units times the original selling price. Now this is where you need to make sure you're taking the new number of units times the new variable expense, right? The one we added $4 to. And then fixed expenses are fixed this time. We didn't, because we went back to the original numbers, right? Before that advertising scenario. And so then I just take the sales minus the variable minus the fixed equals my net operating income. Here was my original and here's my new. So it increased by, the difference is 6,000. Obviously, we're making more money, so the answer to should we do the higher quality components? The answer is yes. Okay. Question 5 is a bear, but if you just take it a step at a time. Oh, apparently I forgot to. Okay. I'm gonna. Okay. I'm just gonna delete my information here because it's better for you if you watch me go through all of the steps. Sorry about that. Okay, we'll go to that point. Sorry. Linden Company is the exclusive distributor for an automotive product that sells for $28 per unit. So I left that one right there. There's my selling price. Has a contribution margin ratio of 30%. Okay. And the company's fixed expenses are $147,000 per year. And the company plans to sell 19,500 units this year. Okay. So they want to know, first of all, what are the variable expenses per unit? Well, there's a couple of ways we can go about that. So we know that sales minus um, minus variable equals contribution margin. And we also know that sales is the 100%, right? And they told us contribution margin was 30%. And I can also figure out my total sales by taking my selling price per unit times the number of units. And I know that contribution margin ratio is 30% of sales. So a couple things we can do. And remember, we're drilling down, we're trying to get to variable expense per unit. So it's going to take several steps. So I'm working on totals right now. Although, okay, I'm going to finish what I'm doing and then I'm going to show you an easier way. So if I want to, I can take sales times 30%, right? So that's contribution margin ratio. And then subtract total sales minus contribution margin equals. And the other thing is I know that variable expense um, is going to be 70%, right? Because variable expense and contribution margin together add up to the sales, that 100%. So then my per unit, I would take my total variable divided by the number of units, giving me my per unit. Okay, the simpler way to do that would have been to take equals the selling price per unit times the contribution margin ratio. Nope. Times 1 minus. Whoops. Right? Because that'll give me the 70%. And I still have that $19.60. So yeah, lots of ways to get to that one. Hopefully I didn't confuse you too much. So again, my selling price per unit is this. And then my contribution margin per unit is going to be selling price minus variable expenses equals that. Okay. And I don't think we needed anything else um, for required one. But I am going to just move my fixed expenses down here from what they gave me, just because required 2, we're going to need that number. So now that we've got all this information, I've got the contribution margin per unit and the contribution margin ratio. Now I can go on to required 2. What is the break even point in unit sales and in dollar sales? So first they want it in units and then they want it in dollars. So the definition of how you get to the break even in units is the fixed expense, right? Because that's what we're break even just means there's nothing left over after we pay fixed expense. And so the contribution margin needs to cover the fixed expenses. And so to get the break even in units, we take the fixed expense divided by the per unit contribution margin. Okay. No idea where I have the reference to. Okay. So I'm going to go equals the fixed expense divided by the per unit contribution margin. Okay, not the ratio, but the dollar amount. And that will get me to units. Okay, now to get to dollar sales, that's going to be the fixed expense. Again, that's what we're trying to cover, divided by the contribution margin ratio. So equals my fixed expense divided by the contribution margin ratio. Okay. Now, when they talk about target profits, right? What is the amount of unit sales and dollar sales required to attain a target profit? So for me, it's 63,000. Excuse me. So now the difference is we're trying to cover the fixed expenses and the target profit with our contribution margin. And so to get unit sales to target profit, it's the target profit plus the fixed expense divided by the unit contribution margin. Okay, so I'm going to take equals, open parentheses, my target profit plus my fixed expense, close parentheses, divided by my contribution margin per unit because I want this in units. So the dollars divided by the dollars take you to units. Okay, now for required 3, they want to know the dollar sales to break or to the target profit. So again, we have the target profit plus the fixed expenses divided by the contribution margin ratio. So use the ratio to get to dollar sales. So we're going to go equals target profit plus fixed expenses. And somebody should be yelling about now because I forgot my parentheses, and that will make a wrong answer if you don't have your parentheses. Now I can divide by the contribution margin ratio. Okay, so there's my dollar sales to the target profit. Now we're going to make all kinds of assumptions again. So assume that by using a more efficient shipper, the company is able to reduce its variable expense by $2.80 per unit. Okay, so I'm going to reduce my variable expense by 2.8. So again, let's see, what do I need? So my per unit sales was 28. My variable was 1960, but now I'm reducing it by $2.80. So then my new contribution margin minus, so sales minus variable per unit. Now, this is important. I have a new contribution margin ratio now. And so I figure that out by taking the contribution margin per unit divided by the selling price per unit to get my new contribution margin ratio. And I need that, right? Because I've got 2 things to answer. They want, first, they want the new break-even point in unit sales. So again, that's going to be equal to the fixed expense divided by my new contribution margin per unit, right? Because I'm getting it to unit sales. So the dollars divided by the dollars gets me to units. Okay. And then my new break-even point in dollar sales is going to be equal to my fixed expenses divided by my new contribution margin ratio. Okay. Now, the last one, what dollar sales is required to attain a target profit of 63,000? So again, that's going to be equal to, open parentheses, that's $63,000 target profit plus the fixed expense, because that's what we need to cover now, and that is dollar sales. So I divide it by the contribution margin ratio because they want the answer in dollars. Okay, that's question 5. Now, question 6. I'm going to throw this out there at the very beginning. This is the first time where even though if you end up with a net operating loss, even though you're labeling it a loss, you have to put it in with the negative, with the minus sign if you get a loss. Otherwise, it will be wrong in the book because the computer is correcting it. And so even if you have the right number, you've got to have the minus sign just on this required one for number 6. And I don't know why the book doesn't have the instructions on this one. But from here on out in the book, pay attention. In the book, usually they will tell you in red words when they want things put in it as a negative. But that's my tip right there. Question 6, required 1. If you end up with a net loss, make sure you enter it into McGraw-Hill with a negative sign in front of it. Okay. Last year, Minden Company introduced a new product that sold 25,400 units. Okay. At a price of $96 per unit. So my selling price per unit, right? Sales price per unit, 96. The product's variable expenses are $66 per unit. And its fixed expenses are a total. So see, I have a per unit, and then I have totals, and then I have my ratios. So right now I'm just putting in what they've given me. But I want to make sure I put this on the fixed expenses line. Okay, so there's my fixed expenses. What is the product's net operating income or loss last year? So I need to figure out my sales. So I equal my selling price times the number of units. And again, all of that information was up in this first paragraph. And then my my variable is also going to be my variable expense per unit times the number of units. And then my total contribution margin will be the sales minus the variable equals contribution margin. And then I put my fixed expense from up here. And so I will equal my contribution margin minus my fixed expense equals a net operating loss of $75,000. So if I were to input this into McGraw-Hill, I would put negative 75,000. Okay. So that was required 1. What is the product's break-even point in unit sales and dollar sales? Okay, so I need to find out my contribution margin per unit. So that'll be my selling price per unit minus my variable expenses per unit. And then I need to figure out my contribution margin ratio. And remember, I can do that by either dividing total contribution margin divided by total sales or contribution margin per unit divided by sales, because this is a ratio. Either one is going to give you the right answer. So I'm going to take contribution margin per unit divided by selling price per unit. Okay, so my contribution margin ratio is 31%. And you don't have to do this, but just for fun, my variable expense ratio is the difference between 100% and 31%. So you don't have to figure that out, but I did because sometimes I do extra things. Okay. So remember, first, the break-even point in units. So this is going to be the fixed expenses, right? We need to the contribution margin to totally cover the fixed expenses so that we end up with a zero net income. Let's see. So they want it in units. So I will then divide this by the contribution margin per unit. And that gives me the break-even point in units. Then they also want it in dollar sales. So that will equal the fixed expense divided by then the contribution margin ratio because they want it in dollars. Okay, now what do they want? Assume the company has conducted a marketing study that estimates it can increase annual sales of the product by $5,000 or 5,000 units for each $2 reduction in selling price. If the company will only consider price reductions in increments of $2, such as going from 68 to 66, etc., what is the maximum annual profit that it can earn on this product? And what sales volume and selling price per unit generate the maximum profit? So required 3, they're looking for 3 answers, and we're going to make a chart. Okay, so and our starting point is going to be where we start here. So my total sales is right there because I figured that out, right? By doing the sales price times the units. And then my starting point price is my selling price per unit. And my number of units is equal to the number of units we started with. My variable per unit is 66. And then my contribution margin is my selling price minus my variable. Matches up. My fixed expense is going to remain fixed, so I'm going to anchor that for fun. Oops, that's not what I want to do. And then my profit equals sales minus, open parentheses, the units times the variable per unit, close parentheses, minus the fixed expense. Let's see if I did that right. Oh, you know what? I'm sure I did that right, but there's an easier way to do that. I'm going to do a shorter formula. So profit is going to be equal to, open parentheses, my contribution margin times the units, close parentheses, minus the fixed expense. That's easier, right? Because this is what's left after paying my variable expenses. So all I need now is to find out how much is my contribution margin and then subtract my fixed expenses from that. Okay, that was easier. And I know I did it right because now all of these numbers match my original data up here, right? So now we're going to fill in the next row of cells. And I put, here's my $2 that each one's going to be reduced by. And here's my 5,000 that each one is going to be increased by. Is that right? $2 reduction in selling price. Let's see, an increase of 5,000 units for each $2 reduction. Okay. So I'm going to go slow on this so I don't make any mistakes. So I'm going to start with my selling price. So it's going to be equal to this number minus the $2, and I'm going to anchor the cell with the $2 because I don't want that one to move, but I want this one to move when I drag the formula down. So my whole point in this row, in row 2, is I'm trying to create formulas that then I can just drag down really quick and Excel will fill in the rest of the sheet for me. Okay. And then same thing here, equals the units plus 5,000, and I'm going to anchor the 5,000. Okay, so with that information, then I can figure out my total sales, right? Because that's the selling price times the units. And I don't anchor either of those because when I drag it down, I want it to reference the cells as I go down. The variable expense per unit stays the same, right? Always. So I'm going to anchor that one. Oops. I'm going to anchor that one. Okay. And then contribution margin then will be equal to the selling price minus the variable expense per unit. Now, fixed expense, that stays fixed the whole way down. So I'm going to anchor that one. And then the profit will be, if I remember this right, so equals, open parentheses, the number of units times the contribution margin per unit, close parentheses, minus the fixed expense. There's my profit. Okay. Now with those in the second row properly anchored, now I can select just the second row. Don't accidentally grab the first row. Select that whole row. I grab this little square right here, and I can drag those formulas down, and Excel fills in the chart for me just like magic, which makes it so much easier than having to do every single one of those myself. Oh, that's hilarious. Okay, I'm going to do this an even simpler way. No, I'm not going to work. Okay, what I meant to do, I'm going to delete this one, delete this one. So I just realized in my original chart, I did, so I did equals, open parentheses, selling price minus variable, close parentheses, times the units so that I have my total contribution margin. You can do it either way, but I just want to make sure I don't mess up, so I'm making it match what I had done before. And then my profit will be then equals contribution margin minus fixed. So again, there's my 75,000. So let's see. Okay, so I'm going to drag that formula to right here. Okay. And then dragging that formula down. Okay. So now just remember the ones I have anchored is the one that was referencing the $2 and the one that was referencing the $5,000. And then this variable is always the same and this fixed is always the same. So now I'm going to pull that down again, populate. Okay. So the original question was they want to know what is the maximum annual profit? Well, because I just made this chart, all I need to do now is visually look up and down and find the profit that is the highest. So with that scenario, for me, this is my highest profit. So my maximum annual profit then is equal to 171,000. And the number of units is on that same line under units. And then the selling price per unit is also on that same line, the 86. So that's why I highlighted that row so that I could easily see which numbers I needed out of that chart. Okay, so now in required for, let me just read it. So then they just want to know the break-even point in unit sales and in dollar sales using this new selling price we just determined. So I need to know my contribution margin ratio and I need to know my per unit contribution margin. So real easy, I'm just going to do my ratio with my selling price per unit. Oh, wait, first I'm going to figure out my unit contribution margin. So that will be equal to the selling price minus the variable per unit. Okay, so I have a per unit contribution margin of $20. Now I can get my ratio because I divide the per unit contribution margin divided by the selling price. Okay, now with those two numbers, I'm ready to figure out the break-even point in units. So again, I take the fixed expense, which I can grab it from anywhere because it's the fixed expense, it's always fixed, and I'm getting it in units. So I take my divided by my per unit contribution margin. And then break-even point in dollar sales. Again, I take my fixed expense divided by the contribution margin ratio that I just figured out. And that is how you do number 6.